What were his prior encounters with law enforcement?
My understanding, it's been reported that he is the individual who reported Brian to the police previously.
For what?
I don't know.
He called the police on his own son?
I believe so.
Kohberger maintains his innocence. His current attorney claims a housemate who survived the attack has information that could clear him.
More victims are coming forward.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, I don't know about you, but I've never seen it reported anywhere besides, this clip on ABC, which aired a few weeks back, that Kohberger's own father turned his son in to the cops once upon a time, probably when he was still a heroin addict. And that's according to his former lawyer. What that incident at some unknown time sort of tells us, and the incident that's just become public, the traffic stop on October 14th, that's 1 month and 1 day after the murders. Before the murders. What it shows is that Kohberger has dealt with law enforcement before. And it kind of raises the question, is it a case of familiarity breeds contempt?
You're not supposed to proceed into the intersection until you can go, because a lot of people do what you just did, right? Is like you're sitting in the intersection waiting, and then turns, and then you're blocking. So
yeah, there was a little bit of confusion with speeding because someone had stopped. I wasn't sure what they were doing, and then they put on their light to turn. Mm-hmm. So I thought that maybe they were letting me go through. Oh. Did you see that?
No. Mm-mm.
Yeah, like right before I made the turn, there was someone who made a right. They didn't have their signal on, so I wasn't sure if they were just waiting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would just advise just don't enter the intersection until you can go, so you don't get stuck. Let's see.
But in that situation, the best thing to do then would be back up and not...
I don't know if there's a best thing to do in that situation, because you're either going to back up and...
We know that the 28-year-old criminology PhD student was also stopped by police on the 21st of August for failing to wear his seatbelt. I think that incident occurred quite late at night. According to The Independent, the traffic stop on the 21st of August took place at around 11:40 p.m. at the intersection of West Pullman Road and Farm Road in Moscow, Idaho. And obviously this one took place in Pullman. According to The Independent, and this is again a reference to the 21st of August stop, it wasn't clear what Kohberger was doing in the area at the time, just 1.7 miles and a 5-minute drive from the home on King Road where Kaylee, Madison, Zaina, Ethan, and Ethan was stabbed to death on 13 November. Of course, there were also the twin stops on the I-70 in Indiana after the murders on December 15th. The first one by a Hancock County Sheriff's Deputy, and then the second on the same day by Indiana State Police. And so I think there are a couple of questions that arise as a result of this, but one of them is there some kind of statistical relationship between the number of times you've been stopped or someone has been stopped by police and potential criminal leaning? Is that any kind of indication? In other words, is lawlessness on the road or in one's vehicle, is that any indication of lawlessness in general? Is one's attitude to law enforcement when you're in a car any indication of your attitude to the law in general? What do you think that tells us in the Kohberger scenario versus anyone else? Or what about Brian Laundrie? So in sum, in terms of the traffic stops alone, we know that Kohberger was stopped at least 4 times in 5 months. Now, I don't always think that it's a good idea to compare ourselves, but if you compare yourself, how do you compare? It's not a very accurate or scientific comparison, but I think it is worth thinking about. And so if we add the incident where his father turned himself in, that's 5 incidents. And I think there are probably a lot more. So one does wonder how many incidents are there in total, just traffic violations kind of thing. But if you just think about 4 incidents in 5 months, in the 5 months surrounding this particular incident, that's a fair amount of brushes with the law. And arguably, a sense of familiarity with law enforcement and dealing with law enforcement and what they are like to deal with. I've been in the USA for a month and a week with a fair amount of driving, and touch wood, I haven't been stopped once. I have actually seen cruisers outside Moscow on my way to Moscow from Boise and from Moscow back to Boise. I've seen them all over the place. I saw some yesterday. The closest I've come to one of them is photographing a cop car near Isla Vista yesterday. So one also passes the Moscow PD office on the outskirts of Moscow on the highway. So even if you're not looking for Moscow PD, they're right there if you're on your way out of Moscow back down to Boise. But it's on the, as I say, the opposite side of town if you were going to, if you were Kohberger heading to Pullman from Moscow or coming from Pullman into Moscow, well, you wouldn't go past Moscow PD. So the question also arises, if you did, would that have factored into what happened here? And I guess the question kind of comes up, is a police presence going to impact someone's behavior? And I think the answer is yes. But only certain kinds of behavior, I would say. Kohberger, perhaps like Brian Laundrie, seems to take these brushes with the law in his stride. Not necessarily at the time. I mean, we can see and hear that he speaks fairly intelligently, but we also see that he has a sort of bug-eyed affect with an A. But perhaps afterward, Kohberger has a sense of himself as being smarter than and effectively above the law. In this incident in Pullman, Washington, he clearly seems to be arguing that he knows the law, and he does this from the context that he sort of does know the law as a criminology student. But of course, he doesn't know the law as a, in terms of the traffic aspect. But the flip side of it is that it is fairly straightforward. You can't enter a blocked off space. And so reversing out of it or any other excuse doesn't actually fly. The space has got to be left open. So we are going to talk a little bit more about we're going to drill down into this incident. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're enjoying this episode and this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Now let's deal with Kohberger's effect. The nearly 10-minute video starts with the officer getting out of her patrol vehicle after stopping Kohberger and parking behind his white 2015 Hyundai Elantra, which is seen with a Pennsylvania license plate. The officers, remember, he actually changed those plates after the incident, but here you can actually see the originals. The officer is seen approaching the car from her driver's side, where Kohberger is sitting behind the wheel with the window rolled down. One wonders what that's about. Why was his window rolled down? Was it simply because it was hot outside? Was that his habit? Had he come back from somewhere else and had the window open, perhaps to hear certain sounds? Anyway, she then says, I think you know why I stopped you. You ran the red light. And then it's quite interesting, this what actually happened business. His response is, his first words to her are, what actually happened? Those
Block an
3
intersection
words.
like that
What
in Washington.
actually happened
Just
was
by you
I was
blocking
stuck.
the intersection, that's technically a
What
ticketable
actually happened
violation.
was I was stuck
And then thus,
in
you're
the
running a
middle
red
of
light.
the intersection. If you just think of those words, these are, of all the words that he could choose to use, these are the words that he uses. What actually happened was I was stuck in the middle of the intersection. He was trying to get somewhere and he kind of found himself stuck. And so what did he do from that point onwards? Can you see, this is already a reframing by him of reality. The officer confronts him with what he did. She said, I was right behind you. I could see exactly what you were doing. And Kohberger ultimately wins this argument because he isn't fined. But technically, he loses it because in reality, what he did, for whatever reason, he shouldn't have done. And so this is a mini analogy for if I tell you a certain kind of story, I can get away with something that is actually technically or otherwise illegal. So
the
the
white
officer
line.
says,
Drivers
yeah,
do it
I was
all the
behind you the
time,
whole time, whatever your actually
Never even
is.
occurred to me that that was
So technically, you're
actually
not
something
supposed to
wrong,
enter
but
the
I-
intersection
Yeah.
at
except for the
all
fact that I was
for
blocking.
that reason, because if the light turns red, then you're stuck in the intersection and then you run the red light. So can you see the officer basically responds by saying, despite your story, in spite of your story, I saw everything. So the officer asks for Kohberger's driver's license, vehicle registration, and proof of insurance. Kohberger hands over the documents and then asks the officer to explain the traffic laws. Can you explain this to me a little bit further? And then he says, I'm from a very rural area, and we actually, it's the second use of that word, we actually don't have like crosswalks. There's a little bit more leeway as well, right? So he's kind of letting her know, you know what, this is how the law works where I'm from. And that's quite an interesting position. You might say, yeah, wouldn't anybody say that? Would you in that situation? But for me, that double use of the word actually is patronizing, because he's trying to educate her on the law when she obviously knows the law, and also trying to provide her with a context for why the law may or may not apply to him. You may say, it's not patronizing, I would do the same thing, but ask yourself, isn't Kohberger a patronizing fellow in the first place? Wasn't it patronizing of him to grade his students as strictly as he did? So it's like, I'm going to grade my students strictly, but don't grade me strictly when I am in your state crossing over in an intersection, right? He's expecting his own students to be at the standard he was at as a 28-year-old. Well, that's like the officer expecting him to be, at the state that, in the state that she's in. And I mean, that's reasonable from her perspective. Is it reasonable from his perspective? So bear in mind, the cop stopping him is also a female cop, and Kohberger was also said to be particularly condescending of his female students, right? According to the New York Post, quote, it's hard to see a pattern emerging while you're in the classroom, but he would tend to push back when a female was talking more than a male talking, Roberts told the Idaho Statesman. So I do think one has got to wonder, if a male cop had stopped Kohberger, would he also have asked for an explanation of the law? And would he have made the remark about things being different in his state? If the male cop had said, well, sir, I saw what you did and you're not allowed to do it. Also, would a male cop have gone back and checked the law? Would a male cop have let him off the hook after all of that? So I think this is a useful glimpse into the way Kohberger deals with authority. And probably is a similar way to the way he dealt with the people around him in general. I'm talking about within the college setting, people above him and below him. Do you remember what his students and peers, one of them was Ben Roberts, said to the Idaho Statesman? Roberts said, quote, that Kohberger was, quote, more keen on asking probing questions and things like that. Another student, I think an anonymous student, said that Kohberger talked down to LGBTQ individuals and those in a marginalized community, those who were disabled, but women in particular. So although there isn't an explicit sense of Kohberger talking down to the officer here, there is a sense that he feels he didn't do anything wrong, even though in Moscow and in Idaho, he did do something wrong. He would do something wrong, or it looks like he did something wrong. When I drove through Idaho a few weeks ago, I came across many signs referring to Idaho traffic laws. I came across many signs in the streets saying, keep clear. It's quite obvious. After several months in Idaho, I don't know whether Kohberger could claim not to know about these signs, whether you want to say Idaho or Washington. Away from home for months at a time, did he still not know about how to drive, what other people were doing? You tend to notice these things. Also, did he not read or notice the signs? Because I noticed them. I'm noticing them. A student also described how Kohberger appeared to get upset when another person put up a Pride ally flag on a door. So he can kind of get triggered pretty quickly. So the other thing that I think is worth noting is that he argues, then he apologizes. So only once Kohberger realizes he's not going to be ticketed does he apologize for his attitude. Although he says, I do apologize if I was asking you too many questions about the law. I wasn't trying to disagree with you. The officer then says she understands the question and they part ways. But of course, that's exactly what he was doing. He was trying to disagree. And so one has the sense that Kohberger is aware of social awkwardness and not afraid to apologize, just as Brian Laundrie wasn't afraid to apologize. But there is a passive-aggressive thing going on here as well. Just because he can be passive and say he's sorry doesn't mean he can't be aggressive. And that's not a little aggressive, it's potentially very aggressive as well. So I prepared a much longer script. I actually worked on it all afternoon. I'm kind of running out of time. A friend of mine is barbecuing, so I'm not going to take it further than that. I will do essentially a part 2 to this analysis. I did want to do it live. I just can't quite do it at any time. It's a little bit more difficult than that. But I will do a part 2 to this, dealing with what I feel is, it's a question. Is Brian brazen in this situation, or is he completely normal? Does this situation with the officer tell us anything, reveal anything, or is it a completely normal thing that doesn't reveal anything? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.